You are listening to the story of the last man standing. In the history of American finance, there are names that echo like thunder. Morgan, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt. These were men who didn't just make money. They built the very infrastructure of the modern world. But for a long time, people thought that era was over. They thought the age of the titans was dead, replaced by faceless boards of directors and algorithms and cold, sterile committees. They were wrong. There was one left. One man who carried the fire of the old world into the new. One man who believed that banking was not just a science, but a blood sport. His name is Jamie Dimon. To understand Jamie Dimon, you cannot start in the boardrooms of Wall Street. You have to start in the soil of struggle. You have to go back to a Greek immigrant named Smyrna. Jamie's grandfather was a man who knew what it meant to leave everything behind. He had been a banker in Smyrna, but when he arrived in America, he didn't have a corner office. He was a busboy. He wiped tables. He carried dishes. But he had that immigrant fire that refuses to be extinguished. He worked his way up from the bottom of the restaurant to a job at the Bank of Athens in New York. That DNA, that refusal to accept mediocrity, that absolute obsession with survival, was passed down to his son Theodore, and then to his grandson Jamie. Jamie grew up in Queens and later on Park Avenue, but he was never a soft child of privilege. The Dimon household was a gladiatorial arena. It was loud, it was chaotic, it was brilliant. Dinner time wasn't about polite conversation. It was a debate club. It was a contact sport. If you had an opinion, you had to defend it. If you didn't have facts, you were destroyed. His father Theodore was a stockbroker, a man who loved the markets, and he taught Jamie the language of money before he could even drive a car. But more importantly, he taught him that the truth is the only thing that matters, not politeness, not feelings, the truth. This upbringing forged a personality that was sharper than a razor blade. By the time Jamie got to Harvard Business School in 1980, he was already different. He wasn't there to network and drink champagne. He was there to conquer. He wore his ambition on his sleeve. He was loud. He was brash. He asked the questions that the professors were afraid to answer. While other students were chasing the highest salaries, Jamie was looking for something else. He was looking for a teacher. He was looking for a destiny. And in 1982, destiny walked into the room. His name was Sandy Weill. This is the most critical chapter in the legend of Jamie Dimon. You cannot tell the story of the king without telling the story of the emperor who made him. Sandy Weill was a legend, but in 1982, he was a wounded lion. He had built a brokerage empire from scratch, but he had just been pushed out of American Express. He was sitting in a small office at the Seagram building, feeling ignored and angry. He was looking for a second act. He needed a partner. He needed a partner, someone with the energy to execute his vision. Jamie's friends told him to run the other way. They said Sandy Weill was crazy. They said he was volatile. They said he screamed at people. They said joining him was career suicide. Jamie had offers from Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, the gold standards of banking. But Jamie didn't want to be just another cog in a golden machine. He wanted to build the machine. So he did the unthinkable. He turned down the prestige. He turned down the money. And he went to work as the assistant to the exiled Sandy Weill. For the next year, it was just the two of them. They sat in a small suite, staring at the walls, waiting for the phone to ring, plotting their comeback. It was the most unglamorous work imaginable. They were two unemployed bankers with big egos and no bank. But in that silence, a bond was formed that was stronger than blood. They became a two-headed monster. Sandy was the visionary, the deal-maker, the gut instinct gambler. Jamie was the operator, the number cruncher, the man who checked the details. It was brutal. It was painful, but it worked. Commercial credit became a profit machine. And then they went on a shopping spree that has never been equaled in the history of finance. With the profits from commercial credit, they bought Primerica. Then they bought Smith Barney. Each time they bought a company, Jamie Dimon would descend upon it like a hawk. He would rip apart the IT systems and merge them. He would fire the underperformers. He would integrate the cultures by sheer force of will. He was gaining a reputation. People started to whisper about the whiz kid. They said he was a computer with a heart of stone. They said he was the only man who could manage Sandy Whale's ego. But the biggest prize was yet to come. It was 1998. The world was changing. The laws that separated commercial banking from investment banking were crumbling. Sandy Weil had a dream. He wanted to create the ultimate bank, a financial supermarket, a place where you could open a checking account, buy a stock, get an insurance policy, and merge a corporation all under one roof. He wanted to buy Citibank. The merger of Travelers and Citibank was the largest financial deal in history. It shook the earth. It created a behemoth called Citigroup. It was a monster with over 100 million customers in 100 countries. And sitting at the top of this empire were the two men who had started in that small office 16 years ago. Sandy Weil was the chairman. Jamie Dimon was the president. Jamie was the heir apparent, the crown prince. It was understood by everyone that when Sandy retired, Jamie would take the throne. He was young, he was brilliant, and he had played a pivotal role in every single victory. But Shakespeare teaches us that power is a poison. As Citigroup grew, the relationship between Sandy and Jamie began to rot. It started with small things, disagreements in meetings, clashes over strategy. But the real issue was control. Jamie Dimon was no longer the obedient assistant. He was a grown man. He was 42 years old. He was wealthy. He was powerful. And he had an ego that matched Sandy's. He started to challenge his mentor in public. He started to assert his authority over parts of the business that Sandy considered his own territory. The court of Citigroup became divided. There were the Sandy loyalists and the Jamie loyalists. The atmosphere was toxic. The father and the son were at war. The breaking point was personal. It was petty, and it changed the course of financial history. It happened at a corporate retreat in November 1998 at a resort called the Greenbrier. The air was thick with tension. The issue at hand was a personnel decision. Sandy Weil wanted to promote his own daughter Jessica Weil within the company's asset management division. Jamie Dimon, who was obsessed with meritocracy, who hated nepotism, who believed that the only thing that mattered was performance, refused. He said no. He said no to the man who made him. He said no to the emperor. The argument was explosive. It was the final straw. Sandy Weil realized that he could no longer control his creation. He realized that as long as Jamie was there, he would never truly be the only king. A few days later, Jamie was sitting in his office at Citigroup. The phone rang. It was Sandy. He asked Jamie to come to the conference room. When Jamie walked in, he saw not just Sandy, but the general counsel of the company. The mood was funeral. Sandy didn't look him in the eye. He just said it. "We want you to resign." Jamie was stunned. He asked why. Sandy just said, "It's not working out." In a matter of minutes, 16 years of brotherhood, 16 years of war, 16 years of building an empire were erased. Jamie Dimon was fired. He was stripped of his title. He was escorted out of the building he helped build. The news hit Wall Street like a nuclear bomb. The prince was dead. The stock market couldn't believe it. How could Sandy Weil fire the brain behind the operation? How could he cut off his right hand? For Jamie Dimon, this was not just a career setback. It was a death in the family. He went home to his wife and his 3 daughters, and he cried. He was a man who defined himself by his work. He was a banker. That was who he was. And now he was nothing. He told people later that he felt like he had been kicked out of his own house. He felt betrayed. He felt foolish. This is the moment where most people would have broken. He had hundreds of millions of dollars. He could have retired. He could have bought an island. He could have spent the rest of his life playing golf and complaining about how he was wronged. But Jamie Dimon is not like most people. He entered the wilderness. For 18 months, he didn't work. But he didn't rest. He went to the gym and boxed until his knuckles were raw, working out the anger. He read biographies of political leaders trying to understand the nature of betrayal and redemption. He spent time with his family. And he waited. The phone kept ringing. Amazon called. They wanted him to be CEO. Home Depot called. Every headhunter in the world wanted Jamie Dimon. But he said no. He didn't want to run a tech company. He didn't want to sell lumber. He was a banker. It was in his blood. He wanted to get back into the arena. He wanted to prove Sandy Weil wrong. He wanted to prove to the world that he wasn't just a number two. He needed a fixer-upper. He needed a mess. In the year 2000, he found it. Bank One in Chicago was a disaster. It was the fifth largest bank in the country, but it was falling apart. It was a collection of different banks that had been mashed together without any strategy. The costs were out of control. The morale was low. It was exactly the kind of challenge Jamie craved. He packed his bags and moved his family from the center of the universe, New York City, to Chicago. The Wall Street elite laughed. They said he was stepping down. They said he was going to the minor leagues. They said he would fade into obscurity in the Midwest. They had no idea what was coming. Jamie hit Chicago like a hurricane. On his first day, he walked into the headquarters and he felt the lethargy. He felt the bureaucracy. He famously put a button on his lapel that said, "No whining." He called a town hall meeting and told the employees that the party was over. He told them that they were going to become the best bank in America or they were going to die trying. He did exactly what he had done at Commercial Credit, but on a massive scale. He slashed the board of directors in half. He fired the consultants. He stopped the corporate perks. He discovered that the bank was paying for thousands of newspaper subscriptions that nobody read. Canceled. He found out they were leasing expensive real estate they didn't use. Sold. But he didn't just cut. He invested. He put his own money, millions of dollars of his own cash, into buying Bank One stock. He told the employees, "I am in the boat with you." He visited the call centers. He listened to the customer service complaints. He memorized the numbers. If a manager didn't know their numbers, Jamie would tear them apart in a meeting. But if they did a good job, he would praise them like a hero. The culture at Bank One changed overnight. It went from a sleepy, failing institution to a lean, mean fighting machine. The stock price began to climb. The profits began to return. Wall Street stopped laughing. They started watching. For 4 years, Jamie polished this diamond in the rough. He was patient. He knew that if he built a fortress, the world would come to him. And in 2004, the world came knocking. JPMorgan Chase was one of the most prestigious names in banking history, the bank of JPMorgan himself. But it was struggling. It lacked leadership. It lacked the killer instinct. They looked at what Jamie was doing in Chicago, and they realized they needed him. They didn't just want to buy Bank One. They wanted to buy Jamie Dimon. The deal was struck. JPMorgan Chase acquired Bank One for $58 billion. On paper, it was an acquisition, but in reality, it was a reverse takeover. Jamie Dimon returned to New York not as the prodigal son, but as the conquering hero. He was named President and Chief Operating Officer with the promise that he would soon be CEO. He walked back onto Wall Street, and the atmosphere changed. The boy who had been fired 6 years earlier was now running the most historic bank in America. He had his revenge. But he didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. He went to work. He looked at JP Morgan's balance sheet and he saw cracks. The year was 2005. The housing market was starting to get hot. Everyone was making easy money. Subprime mortgages were the new gold rush. Banks were packaging risky loans and selling them as safe investments. The music was playing and everyone was dancing. But Jamie Dimon didn't like the music. He looked at the data and his gut told him something was wrong. He saw that people were borrowing money they couldn't pay back. He saw that the prices of homes were defying gravity. He started to ask the hard questions. What happens if housing prices drop? What happens if unemployment goes up? His competitors called him paranoid. They called him old-fashioned. They said he was leaving money on the table. Citigroup was dancing. Merrill Lynch was dancing. Lehman Brothers was drunk on risk. But Jamie pulled back. In 2006, he ordered his team to reduce their exposure to subprime mortgages. He sold off billions of dollars of risky assets. He started to build what he called the fortress balance sheet. He wanted more cash, more reserves, more armor. He told his shareholders, "We are preparing for a storm." He didn't know how big the storm would be. He didn't know that a tsunami was forming out in the ocean that would wipe away the foundations of global capitalism. He just knew that trees don't grow to the sky and that markets don't go up forever. While the rest of Wall Street was popping champagne corks in 2007, Jamie Dimon was boarding up the windows. He was drilling his team on disaster scenarios. He was checking the lifeboats. And then, on a cold morning in March 2008, the sky turned black. The tsunami made landfall, and the first victim was Bear Stearns. This was the moment history had been waiting for. This was the moment the training, the betrayal, the exile, the discipline all converged. The phone rang at 270 Park Avenue. It was the Federal Reserve. They weren't asking for advice. They were begging for help. They said, "Jamie, we need you."